There are chapters of human history that seem to vanish into shadow, leaving behind only whispers and fragments. Periods where the light of knowledge appears to dim, where entire civilizations seem to slip into silence. What if I told you that one of history's most famous dark periods wasn't actually dark at all, but deliberately obscured by those who had everything to gain from keeping the world in ignorance? Welcome to Sleep Mysteries, where hidden history meets your bedtime. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, we're diving into one of the most controversial questions in historical research: the Dark Ages. That mysterious 1,000-year span from roughly 500 to 1500 CE has long been portrayed as humanity's great intellectual slumber. But what if this entire narrative was constructed to hide something far more significant? If you find yourself drawn to these hidden histories and forgotten mysteries, consider joining our community of truth seekers. Your support helps us continue uncovering the stories that conventional wisdom would rather keep buried. Now, let me take you on a journey through the shadows of medieval Europe, where the line between historical fact and institutional manipulation becomes disturbingly blurred. Because the deeper we dig into this period, the more we discover that the real mystery isn't what humanity forgot during the Dark Ages, but rather what someone desperately wanted us to never remember. The year 476 CE marks what historians call the fall of the Western Roman Empire. A child emperor named Romulus Augustulus was quietly deposed by a barbarian general, and with that bloodless coup, an empire that had dominated the known world for centuries simply ended. Or did it? Here's where our story takes its first strange turn. If you were to search through contemporary accounts from that time, you'd find something peculiar. Nobody who actually lived through this supposed collapse seemed to think it was particularly catastrophic. There were no grand funeral orations for the empire, no dramatic chronicles describing the end of civilization. In fact, many people in former Roman territories continued living much as they always had, following Roman laws, speaking Latin, and maintaining Roman customs. So where does our modern understanding of this period come from? Why do we imagine the fall of Rome as this great civilizational catastrophe that plunged Europe into darkness? The answer lies not in what happened, but in who got to tell the story afterward. As secular Roman institutions crumbled, one organization was perfectly positioned to fill the power vacuum: the Christian Church, which had grown from a persecuted minority to the empire's official religion, suddenly found itself as the only institution with the resources, organization, and authority to maintain any semblance of order. But here's the crucial detail that most history books gloss over. They didn't just inherit political power, they inherited something far more valuable and dangerous: the power to control human memory itself. Think about it logically. When the Roman school system collapsed, who taught children to read? When the great libraries closed their doors, who decided which books were worth preserving? When scholars needed access to ancient texts, who controlled the keys to the vaults? The answer to all these questions points to the same institution, an institution that would spend the next 1,000 years systematically reshaping humanity's understanding of its own past. But let's pause here and consider something that should make us deeply uncomfortable. We're told that for nearly a millennium, one of the most intellectually vibrant regions on Earth, the same continent that had produced Aristotle, Archimedes, and Cicero, somehow forgot how to innovate, how to build, how to think. Does that sound plausible to you? While Europe was supposedly stumbling around in ignorance, let's look at what was happening elsewhere. In China, the Tang dynasty was experiencing a golden age. They invented block printing, developed advanced metallurgy, and created poetry that's still considered among the world's finest. In the Islamic world, Scholars were performing cataract surgery, developing algebra, and building libraries that housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. In India, mathematicians were working with concepts like zero and infinity that wouldn't reach Europe for centuries. Yet we're expected to believe that Europeans, the intellectual heirs of Greece and Rome, were somehow incapable of similar achievements, that they spent 1,000 years huddled in darkness, waiting for the Renaissance to remind them that learning was possible. This narrative becomes even more suspicious when you realize who's been telling it. The term Dark Ages wasn't coined by people living during that period. They didn't wake up each morning thinking, well, here we are in the Dark Ages again. This label was created much later by scholars who had a very specific agenda. They needed to create a stark contrast between their own supposedly enlightened era and the medieval period. But more importantly, they needed to justify why so much knowledge had seemingly vanished from the historical record. Here's where things get truly unsettling. During this so-called dark period, one institution was incredibly busy. Monastic orders were traveling across Europe, collecting manuscripts, texts, and documents from every corner of the former Roman world. They claimed to be preserving knowledge for posterity, but preservation requires access, and access was something they carefully controlled. Imagine you're a monk in the year 700 CE. You've just returned from a journey where you've collected dozens of ancient texts, works of philosophy, mathematics, engineering, medicine. Some of these texts align perfectly with Christian doctrine. Others don't. Some describe natural phenomena without invoking divine intervention. Others present philosophical systems that don't require a church hierarchy. Still others contain practical knowledge that might make people less dependent on clerical authority. Which texts do you think got copied and distributed? Which ones were allowed to survive in multiple copies, ensuring their preservation? And which ones were quietly filed away in restricted archives, accessible only to a select few who could be trusted not to share their contents with the outside world? This wasn't necessarily a conscious conspiracy. It was something potentially more insidious, the gradual, systematic filtering of human knowledge through the lens of institutional self-interest. Every copying decision, every choice about which texts deserve preservation, every judgment about what knowledge was appropriate for public consumption was made by people whose power depended on maintaining certain narratives about the world. Consider the implications of this process. If you control which books survive and which disappear, you effectively control what future generations can know about their past. If you control education, you shape how people think about the present. And if you control both historical narrative and contemporary learning, you wield a form of power that makes military conquest seem crude by comparison. But here's what's truly chilling about this system. It didn't require burning books or executing scholars, though those things certainly happened. It simply required patience. Over time, texts that weren't copied would crumble to dust. Knowledge that wasn't taught would be forgotten. Ideas that weren't discussed would fade from memory. And eventually, people would forget that they had ever known anything different. This brings us to one of the most troubling aspects of the Dark Ages narrative. We're told that this period was characterized by superstition and ignorance, that people had lost the ability to think rationally about the world around them. But what if the opposite was true? What if this was actually a period of incredible intellectual ferment? But the ideas being explored were too dangerous to be allowed into the historical record. Archaeological evidence suggests that medieval Europe was far more sophisticated than we've been led to believe. Advanced agricultural techniques, complex hydraulic systems, architectural innovations that wouldn't be rediscovered until the Renaissance. All of these existed during the supposedly dark centuries. But somehow, the knowledge behind these achievements was never properly documented or disseminated. Why would that be? Perhaps because the people developing these innovations weren't working within church-approved frameworks. Perhaps because their discoveries challenged official doctrines about how the world worked. Or perhaps because their knowledge came from sources, Islamic scholarship, Byzantine texts, ancient pagan traditions, that couldn't be acknowledged without undermining the Church's claim to be the sole source of truth and wisdom. As we dig deeper into this mystery, patterns begin to emerge that suggest something far more systematic than random historical loss. Entire categories of knowledge seem to have been deliberately suppressed. Advanced mathematics, experimental natural philosophy, detailed geographical knowledge, astronomical observations that contradicted official cosmology. All of these vanish from the European record during precisely the period when church control over learning was most complete. But perhaps most tellingly, this knowledge often reappears later in ways that suggest it was never truly lost, merely hidden. The Renaissance, we're told, was sparked by the rediscovery of classical texts. But where had these texts been preserved during the supposedly ignorant medieval period? Who had been quietly maintaining and copying them while the rest of Europe stumbled in darkness? The answer, once again, points us toward the same institution that had spent centuries collecting, controlling, and carefully managing the flow of information. The very organization that benefited most from the narrative of medieval ignorance was also the one best positioned to control which aspects of that ignorance were eventually allowed to end. This pattern of controlled revelation becomes even more disturbing when we examine specific examples of how knowledge was managed during this period. Take mathematics, for instance. We're told that Europeans had forgotten basic arithmetic, that they struggled with calculations that would have been elementary to Roman merchants. Yet somehow, Gothic cathedrals were being constructed with mathematical precision that required advanced understanding of geometry, structural engineering, and architectural mathematics. The builders of these magnificent structures, Chartres, Notre Dame, Salisbury Cathedral, weren't working from crude approximations or divine inspiration alone. They were applying sophisticated mathematical principles, using techniques for calculating load distribution, arch stress, and proportional relationships that suggest access to advanced mathematical knowledge. But where are the treatises explaining these methods? Where are the schools that taught these principles? The official answer is that this knowledge was passed down through guild traditions, master to apprentice in purely practical terms. But this explanation falls apart under scrutiny. The mathematical concepts underlying Gothic architecture weren't simple craft techniques. They represented theoretical understanding that should have left traces in written form. The fact that it didn't suggests either an extraordinary conspiracy of silence among thousands of craftsmen, or more likely, that the theoretical knowledge existed but was carefully contained within institutions that had reasons to keep it restricted. Consider another example that should make us pause. Medieval monasteries were producing illuminated manuscripts of extraordinary beauty and technical sophistication. The creation of these works required detailed knowledge of chemistry, how to create and preserve pigments, how to prepare writing surfaces, how to bind books that would last for centuries. It required understanding of optics for the precise detail work, knowledge of metallurgy for the tool's artistic techniques. Yet, and mastery of complex, we're supposed to believe that the same culture producing these marvels was somehow incapable of scientific thinking, that monks who could create chemical compounds stable enough to retain their colors for 1,000 years had no understanding of natural philosophy. This doesn't add up, unless we consider the possibility that they possessed far more scientific knowledge than they were permitted to share outside their closed communities. The pattern becomes even clearer when we look at what happened during the Crusades. Suddenly, European armies were displaying organizational capabilities, logistical sophistication, and technological innovations that supposedly didn't exist during the Dark Ages. They were building siege engines, coordinating complex military campaigns across vast distances, and adapting quickly to new forms of warfare. This suggests that European society possessed far more advanced knowledge than the official narrative admits, knowledge that was apparently available when needed for church-approved purposes, but remained hidden during peacetime. But perhaps the most telling evidence comes from examining what happened when this carefully controlled system began to break down. The Renaissance, we're told, began when Byzantine scholars fled to Western Europe after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, bringing with them classical texts that had been lost to the West. This story has always felt suspiciously convenient. Are we really supposed to believe that texts which had been lost for centuries were suddenly available in perfect condition, ready to spark an immediate intellectual revolution? The more likely explanation is that many of these texts had never been truly lost at all. They had been preserved, studied, and developed within restricted circles throughout the medieval period. What changed wasn't the availability of the knowledge, but the political and social conditions that had previously made it dangerous to share that knowledge publicly. The Renaissance wasn't a rediscovery, it was a controlled release. This interpretation gains credibility when we examine how quickly Renaissance innovations spread and how sophisticated they were from the very beginning. Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks reveal understanding of principles that supposedly hadn't been explored since antiquity. But his work shows clear evidence of building on existing traditions, refining techniques that had been developed over centuries, not starting from scratch. Where did those traditions come from if the preceding millennium had been truly dark? The answer becomes clear when we realize that Leonardo and his contemporaries had access to restricted libraries, private collections, and institutional knowledge that had been carefully maintained throughout the medieval period. They weren't lone geniuses working in isolation. They were part of networks that had preserved and developed ancient learning while keeping it hidden from broader society. This brings us to one of the most unsettling aspects of this historical manipulation. The institutions that controlled knowledge during the medieval period didn't just passively preserve texts, they actively shaped them. Ancient works were copied, but often with modifications, additions, or omissions that aligned the content with contemporary religious doctrine. Scientific observations were preserved, but framed in theological language that obscured their practical implications. Philosophical ideas were maintained, but stripped of elements that might encourage independent thinking. Over time, this process created a version of ancient learning that was safe for institutional control. Classical knowledge filtered through medieval interpretation. Ancient wisdom repackaged for contemporary consumption. When this modified tradition was eventually released during the Renaissance, it carried both the authority of antiquity and the safety of institutional approval. It was revolutionary enough to seem like genuine rediscovery, but controlled enough to avoid threatening existing power structures. The implications of this systematic knowledge management extend far beyond medieval Europe. If our understanding of the Dark Ages is based on carefully curated evidence, what does that say about our broader historical narrative? How many other periods have been similarly reshaped to serve institutional interests? How much of what we consider established historical fact is actually the product of selective preservation and controlled revelation? These questions become even more pressing when we consider that the same institutions involved in managing medieval knowledge continued to play important roles in education and scholarship for centuries afterward. The university system, the church hierarchy, the academic traditions that shaped modern historical methodology. All of these trace their origins back to medieval institutions that had spent centuries perfecting techniques for controlling information flow. This doesn't necessarily mean that modern historians are conscious participants in some vast conspiracy, but it does suggest that our methods for understanding the past may be fundamentally compromised by inherited assumptions about what constitutes reliable evidence and authoritative interpretation. We've been trained to trust certain types of sources while dismissing others, to accept certain narratives while questioning alternatives, and to interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that support established frameworks rather than challenging them. The Dark Ages mystery forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility that much of what we think we know about the past may be the product of institutional storytelling rather than objective historical analysis. If a 1,000-year period could be successfully rebranded as an age of ignorance and superstition, what other historical narratives might be equally artificial? What other knowledge might be hidden in plain sight, dismissed as myth or legend because it doesn't fit approved interpretations? As we peel back the layers of this carefully constructed narrative, we begin to see the outlines of a very different medieval period, one characterized not by darkness and ignorance, but by the systematic control of light itself. The real Dark Age wasn't a period when knowledge disappeared, but a time when knowledge was weaponized, when information became a tool of control rather than liberation. And perhaps most disturbing of all, this system worked so well that we're still living within its effects today. The story of the Dark Ages isn't just ancient history. It's a masterclass in how institutional power can reshape collective memory, how temporary political arrangements can become permanent historical truth, and how the victors don't just write history, they rewrite it so completely that even the victims forget what really happened. The shadows are long, and they stretch much further into our present than we might want to acknowledge. But what happens when you start looking for the physical evidence that should exist if this narrative were true? What happens when you examine the astronomical records, the archaeological discoveries, the linguistic patterns that should support the official timeline? The deeper you dig, the more the ground beneath the Dark Ages story begins to shift. Let's start with something that cannot be manipulated or rewritten: the movement of celestial bodies. Solar eclipses, lunar cycles, planetary alignments. These cosmic events follow predictable patterns that can be calculated backward through time with extraordinary precision. They serve as humanity's most reliable historical timestamps, immune to political revision or institutional bias. When modern astronomers began cross-referencing ancient eclipse records with the established chronology of medieval Europe, they discovered something deeply troubling. Eclipses that should have been visible and recorded during specific historical events were nowhere to be found in contemporary accounts. Conversely, celestial phenomena that were documented seemed to occur at times when the historical record placed them under clear skies. These weren't minor discrepancies of a few days or weeks. We're talking about gaps of decades, sometimes centuries, between what the sky was actually doing and what the historical timeline claimed was happening on Earth. For an institution that supposedly preserved knowledge so carefully, these astronomical inconsistencies represent a massive problem. Either medieval record keepers were remarkably incompetent at observing the heavens, or something fundamental is wrong with our accepted chronology. The response to these discoveries has been telling. Rather than investigating these astronomical anomalies, mainstream academia has largely ignored them. Papers questioning medieval chronology based on celestial evidence struggle to find publication in respected journals. Researchers who pursue these lines of inquiry find their funding mysteriously reduced, their academic positions threatened, their work marginalized as fringe speculation. But ignoring inconvenient evidence doesn't make it disappear. The stars don't lie, and their testimony suggests that our understanding of medieval time itself may be fundamentally flawed. If the timeline is wrong, then everything built upon that timeline, political histories, cultural developments, technological progress, becomes suspect. This brings us to one of the most radical theories to emerge from serious historical scholarship in recent decades. What if the Dark Ages weren't just misunderstood or misrepresented? What if significant portions of this period never actually occurred at all? The phantom time hypothesis suggests that approximately 3 centuries of European history, roughly from 614 to 911 CE, were artificially inserted into the historical record. According to this theory, events that supposedly took place during these phantom years either happened at different times or never happened at all. The implications are staggering. If true, we might currently be living in the year 1728, not 2024. This sounds impossible until you examine the evidence supporting it. First, there's the remarkable scarcity of reliable artifacts, documents, or architectural remains from these supposedly eventful centuries. Much of what we know about this period comes from sources written hundreds of years later, often by chroniclers who had no direct access to contemporary records. Second, there are the strange repetitions and duplications that appear throughout medieval history. Kings with nearly identical biographies ruling in different centuries, military campaigns that follow suspiciously similar patterns across supposedly unrelated conflicts, cultural developments that seem to replay earlier events with only minor variations in names and locations. Consider Charlemagne, arguably the most famous figure of the early medieval period. His reign from 768 to 814 CE is supposed to mark the revival of Western European civilization after centuries of barbarian chaos. Yet when you examine his biography closely, it bears uncanny similarities to earlier rulers. His military campaigns mirror those of Constantine the Great from 4 centuries earlier. His administrative reforms echo Roman imperial practices. Even his physical description and personality traits seem borrowed from classical sources. Is this because Charlemagne consciously modeled himself on earlier emperors? Or is it because Charlemagne's biography was constructed by later chroniclers who used classical templates to fill in gaps in the historical record? The phantom time hypothesis suggests the latter, that many supposedly medieval figures were literary creations designed to populate artificially extended timelines. But who would have had the motive and capability to execute such a massive chronological manipulation? Once again, the evidence points toward the same institution that controlled medieval education, preserved historical documents, and maintained the calendar systems used to date events. The Church possessed both the technical knowledge of chronometry and the institutional authority to implement timeline modifications across multiple regions simultaneously. The motive becomes clearer when you consider the political benefits of extending the medieval timeline. By inserting phantom centuries between the fall of Rome and their own era, later rulers could claim ancient legitimacy for relatively recent institutions. The Holy Roman Empire could trace its authority back through an unbroken chain of Christian rulers. Papal power could be anchored in centuries of uninterrupted spiritual leadership. Noble bloodlines could claim descent from legendary figures whose existence was vouched for by church-controlled historical records. More importantly, an extended Dark Age timeline created the perfect justification for institutional control over knowledge. If humanity had spent a millennium stumbling in ignorance before the Church brought light back to the world, then questioning church authority wasn't just heresy. It was a dangerous step backward toward the darkness. The longer and darker the supposed age of ignorance, the more necessary institutional guidance appeared. This chronological manipulation wouldn't have required a vast conspiracy involving thousands of participants. It would have needed only a small group of highly placed individuals with access to calendar systems, historical archives, and educational institutions. Changes could have been implemented gradually over decades or centuries, with each generation accepting slight modifications to inherited chronologies. The process might have worked something like this. Scribes copying ancient texts would occasionally correct dates that seemed inconsistent with accepted timelines. Calendar reforms would subtly adjust year counts to align with political necessities. New historical narratives would incorporate extended timeframes to accommodate legendary figures or dynasties that needed ancient pedigrees. Over time, these small adjustments would accumulate into major chronological shifts that became embedded in the historical record. Evidence for this process can be found in the multiple contradictory dating systems that existed throughout medieval Europe. Different regions used different calendars, different starting points for their year counts, and different methods for calculating the passage of time. This chronological chaos would have provided perfect cover for timeline manipulation, as discrepancies between different dating systems could be explained as regional variations rather than systematic distortion. The adoption of the Gregorian calendar in 1582 represents a particularly suspicious moment in this chronological history. Officially, this reform was designed to correct accumulated errors in the Julian calendar system, bringing the calendar year back into alignment with astronomical reality. But the Gregorian reform involved dropping 10 days from the calendar. October 4th, 1582 was followed immediately by October 15th. If the Church was willing to eliminate 10 days from recorded history to fix calendar problems, what's to prevent them from having added years or decades to earlier periods? The same institutional authority that could decree that 10 days never existed could presumably insert phantom time periods into the historical record. The Gregorian reform demonstrates both the technical capability and the institutional willingness to manipulate time itself for practical purposes. The implications extend far beyond medieval chronology. If the Dark Ages timeline has been artificially extended, then our entire understanding of historical development needs revision. Technological progress, cultural evolution, political developments, all of these would have occurred on different timescales than we currently believe. The Renaissance, for example, wouldn't represent humanity emerging from centuries of ignorance, but rather the natural continuation of intellectual traditions that had never actually been interrupted. The supposed gap between classical antiquity and early modern innovation would shrink dramatically, making the continuity of knowledge much more plausible. This revised chronology also explains some of the puzzling aspects of medieval technology and culture. Instead of representing primitive attempts to recreate lost classical achievements, medieval innovations would be seen as natural developments of ongoing intellectual traditions. The sophisticated engineering of Gothic cathedrals, the mathematical precision of medieval astronomy, the chemical knowledge required for manuscript illumination. All of these would make perfect sense as products of continuous rather than interrupted civilizational development. But perhaps the most significant implication involves the nature of institutional power itself. If major religious and political institutions were willing to manipulate the fundamental framework of historical time to serve their interests, what other aspects of received wisdom might be similarly artificial? How many of our basic assumptions about the past are actually products of institutional storytelling rather than objective historical analysis? The phantom time theory forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility that the institutions we trust to preserve and interpret the past may have spent centuries actively reshaping it. The custodians of historical knowledge weren't passive guardians of inherited wisdom. They were active editors, revising the human story to support contemporary power structures. This doesn't necessarily mean that everything we believe about the past is false, but it does suggest that the process of historical preservation has been far more selective and purposeful than we typically acknowledge. The version of history that survived to reach us isn't necessarily the most accurate version. It's the version that best served the interests of the institutions powerful enough to control the preservation process. When you realize that time itself might have been weaponized as a tool of political control, the entire foundation of historical knowledge becomes questionable. If the timeline is wrong, then causation becomes suspect. If the chronology has been manipulated, then the entire narrative of human development requires re-examination. The Dark Ages mystery isn't just about medieval Europe. It's about the fundamental reliability of institutional knowledge. It's about whether we can trust the stories we've been told about our own past, and whether the institutions that shaped those stories deserve the authority we've granted them over our understanding of human history. As we drift deeper into this mystery, the shadows grow longer and the questions more unsettling. Because if they could hide 1,000 years of human achievement behind a veil of manufactured darkness, what else might they be hiding in the depths of their carefully guarded archives? The night is far from over, and the deepest secrets are yet to be revealed. The question of institutional power becomes even more complex when we examine the physical evidence that should support the official narrative. Deep beneath Vatican City, in chambers that have never seen sunlight, lies one of the most mysterious repositories of knowledge in human history. The Vatican Secret Archives, or as they've been diplomatically renamed, the Vatican Apostolic Archives, contain an estimated 53 miles of shelving, holding over 1 million documents spanning more than 1,000 years. But here's what should make your skin crawl as you settle into sleep tonight. Less than 1% of this collection has ever been made available to outside researchers. The rest remains sealed, cataloged in ways that prevent even the most distinguished scholars from knowing what they're being denied access to. When researchers are occasionally granted permission to view specific documents, they're subjected to restrictions so severe that meaningful analysis becomes nearly impossible. No photography, no photocopying, limited viewing time, and access only to materials specifically requested by title. A system that makes discovering unexpected connections or contradictory evidence virtually impossible. What exactly is being protected behind those ancient stone walls? According to the few scholars who've been granted limited access, the archives contain documents that predate the supposed Dark Ages, manuscripts written in languages that haven't been fully deciphered, and astronomical records that don't align with the accepted historical timeline. There are reports of maps showing geographical knowledge that supposedly didn't exist for centuries after they were drawn, mathematical texts containing concepts that weren't officially rediscovered until much later, and medical treatises describing surgical procedures that medieval Europe allegedly couldn't perform. The Vatican's response to inquiries about these materials has been consistent. Benign silence punctuated by claims that the documents are too fragile for general access, too complex for non-specialists to interpret correctly, or too sacred to be examined by secular researchers. But this protective stance raises an obvious question. If these documents support the official historical narrative, why not allow scholars to study them? Academic validation would only strengthen the Church's position as guardian of legitimate historical knowledge. The answer becomes clearer when you consider what unrestricted access to these archives might reveal. Documents that show continuous intellectual development throughout the medieval period would undermine the Dark Ages narrative. Records of advanced knowledge being deliberately suppressed would expose the mechanisms of institutional control. Most dangerously, evidence that the chronological framework itself has been manipulated would call into question the entire foundation of accepted history. This pattern of protective secrecy extends beyond the Vatican's walls. Throughout Europe, archaeological discoveries that don't fit the established timeline have a curious tendency to disappear from public view. Artifacts suggesting advanced medieval technology are quietly removed to storage facilities where they're no longer available for independent analysis. Sites containing evidence of sophisticated pre-Renaissance engineering are restricted from excavation, or their findings are reinterpreted to fit acceptable historical frameworks. Independent researchers who've attempted to document these anomalies face systematic obstruction. Funding disappears, academic positions are terminated, and publication opportunities evaporate. The message is clear. Certain types of historical inquiry are not welcome, regardless of the evidence they might uncover. This institutional resistance to challenging evidence suggests that the stakes involved go far beyond academic disagreement about dating methods or cultural interpretation. Consider the implications of what might be hidden in those sealed archives. If documents exist proving that medieval Europe possessed advanced scientific knowledge, then the entire narrative of the Renaissance as a rediscovery of lost learning collapses. If records show that the supposed Dark Ages were actually periods of significant intellectual achievement, then the Church's role as the sole preserver of civilization during humanity's darkest hour becomes questionable. Most fundamentally, if evidence exists that the chronological framework has been deliberately altered, then virtually everything we think we know about the development of Western civilization requires re-examination. But the control of physical evidence represents only one aspect of a much larger system of knowledge management. The real genius of the Dark Ages narrative lies not in what was hidden, but in what was selectively revealed. The process worked something like this: collect all available knowledge from the collapsing Roman world, preserve it in restricted archives, then gradually release carefully edited versions back to society when political conditions made such revelations advantageous. This explains one of the most puzzling aspects of the Renaissance: how supposedly lost knowledge could reappear in such sophisticated forms so quickly. Leonardo da Vinci's engineering drawings don't look like the work of someone reconstructing half-remembered techniques from fragmentary sources. They demonstrate deep understanding of principles that had clearly been developed over long periods of continuous study. His anatomical studies show familiarity with dissection techniques that supposedly hadn't been practiced for centuries. His mechanical designs incorporate mathematical relationships that suggest access to advanced theoretical frameworks. Where did this knowledge come from if the preceding millennium had been truly dark? The official answer is that Renaissance masters were exceptional geniuses who independently rediscovered lost techniques through pure intellectual brilliance. But this explanation becomes implausible when you realize how many supposedly independent discoveries were happening simultaneously across Europe. The same advanced techniques were appearing in multiple locations, often with remarkably similar approaches to complex problems. The more logical explanation is that this knowledge had never actually been lost. It had been preserved and developed within restricted circles throughout the medieval period. then strategically released when political conditions made such revelations advantageous. The Renaissance wasn't a rediscovery of ancient learning. It was a controlled unveiling of knowledge that had been deliberately kept hidden. This interpretation gained support from examining the social networks surrounding Renaissance innovation. The great masters weren't isolated individuals working in creative vacuum. They were connected to wealthy patrons who possessed extensive private libraries, religious institutions with access to restricted manuscripts, and scholarly networks that had maintained continuous intellectual traditions throughout the supposedly dark centuries. Leonardo da Vinci, for example, had access to the collections of French royalty, Italian nobility, and various religious orders, exactly the institutions that would have preserved advanced knowledge during the medieval period. The timing of Renaissance revelations also suggests deliberate management rather than spontaneous discovery. New knowledge appeared when it served institutional interests, military engineering during periods of conflict, architectural innovations when prestigious building projects required them, astronomical discoveries when calendar reforms were being implemented. This pattern indicates that the flow of information was being carefully controlled to serve contemporary political and religious purposes. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this knowledge management system is how effectively it shaped not just what people knew, but how they thought about knowledge itself. By creating the narrative of the Dark Ages, institutional authorities established themselves as the sole legitimate sources of historical truth. Anyone who questioned the official timeline or suggested alternative interpretations could be dismissed as ignorant of established scholarship or corrupted by heretical influences. This created a self-reinforcing system where challenging the narrative became evidence of unfitness to participate in scholarly discourse. Researchers learned to frame their investigations within acceptable parameters, avoiding lines of inquiry that might threaten established frameworks. Academic institutions developed traditions that prioritized conformity to accepted interpretations over independent investigation of primary sources. Over time, these institutional pressures created a scholarly culture that was more concerned with defending established positions than discovering inconvenient truths. The effects of this system extend far beyond medieval history. The same institutions that managed knowledge during the Dark Ages continue to play important roles in education and scholarship for centuries afterward. The university system, academic publishing, the peer review process. All of these modern institutions trace their development back to medieval foundations that had spent centuries perfecting techniques for controlling information flow. This doesn't mean that contemporary scholars are conscious participants in some ongoing conspiracy. But it does suggest that our methods for evaluating historical evidence may be fundamentally compromised by inherited assumptions about what constitutes reliable sources and legitimate interpretation. We've been trained to trust certain types of evidence while dismissing others, to accept certain narratives while questioning alternatives, and to interpret ambiguous data in ways that support established frameworks rather than challenging them. The Dark Ages mystery reveals the profound vulnerability of historical knowledge to institutional manipulation. If a 1,000-year period could be successfully rebranded as an age of ignorance and superstition, what other historical narratives might be equally artificial? How much of what we consider established fact might actually be the product of selective preservation and controlled revelation? These questions become even more pressing when you consider that the techniques developed for managing medieval knowledge could easily be adapted to contemporary information systems. The same principles that allowed institutional authorities to control historical narrative for centuries, restricting access to primary sources, establishing authorized interpretations, marginalizing dissenting voices, remain effective tools for shaping public understanding today. The digital age has supposedly democratized access to information, but it has also created new opportunities for subtle manipulation. Search algorithms can be designed to prioritize certain sources over others. Social media platforms can amplify approved narratives while suppressing alternative viewpoints. Academic databases can be structured to make certain types of research more difficult to conduct. The tools have evolved, but the fundamental techniques of information control remain remarkably similar to those developed during the medieval period. This continuity suggests that the Dark Ages mystery isn't just ancient history, it's a case study in how institutional power operates across time. The same organizations that shaped medieval knowledge continue to influence contemporary understanding, using evolved but fundamentally similar techniques to maintain control over historical narrative. Understanding how they managed information in the past provides crucial insights into how they might be managing it today. As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider this unsettling possibility. The institutions we trust to preserve and interpret the past may have spent centuries actively reshaping it to serve their own interests. The Dark Ages weren't dark because knowledge disappeared. They were dark because knowledge was deliberately obscured, hidden behind veils of institutional secrecy and selective revelation. The shadows cast by medieval information control stretch far into our present, influencing not just what we know about the past, but how we think about knowledge itself. The real mystery isn't what humanity forgot during the Dark Ages, but what we're still being prevented from remembering. And in those carefully guarded archives, behind those sealed doors, in those restricted collections that no independent researcher has ever been allowed to examine fully, the evidence of our hidden history continues to wait. The night grows deeper, but the questions grow more urgent, because if they could hide a millennium of human achievement behind manufactured darkness, what else might be concealed in the shadows of institutional power? What other truths might be locked away, waiting for the right moment, the right crisis, the right political necessity to be selectively revealed? The game of historical hide-and-seek continues, and we're only beginning to understand the rules. The manipulation of time and knowledge during the medieval period represents just one layer of a much deeper deception. As we peel back these carefully constructed narratives, we begin to encounter evidence that challenges not just our understanding of the Dark Ages, but our entire conception of how human civilization developed. Because hidden within the archives and scattered across archaeological sites that never quite make it into mainstream textbooks, there's a pattern emerging that suggests the story we've been told about human progress is fundamentally incomplete. Let me share something that should make you question everything you think you know about medieval capabilities. In remote corners of Europe, archaeologists have uncovered mechanical devices of extraordinary sophistication, gear systems that demonstrate knowledge of precision engineering, hydraulic mechanisms that rival modern water management, and metallurgical artifacts that display techniques supposedly lost with the fall of Rome. These discoveries consistently date to the heart of the Dark Ages, yet somehow they never make it into the standard historical narrative. Why? Because they don't fit the story we've been taught to believe. Take the Antikythera mechanism, that famous ancient Greek computer discovered in a shipwreck. We marvel at its sophistication, calling it impossibly advanced for its time. But similar devices, though less well-preserved, have been found in medieval contexts across Europe. The difference is that while the Greek mechanism gets celebrated as evidence of ancient genius, the medieval examples get quietly filed away as unexplained anomalies, too inconvenient to acknowledge within the framework of the Dark Ages narrative. This selective attention to archaeological evidence reveals something disturbing about how historical truth gets constructed. Evidence that supports accepted narratives receives extensive study, publication, and public attention. Evidence that challenges those narratives gets minimized, reinterpreted, or simply ignored. Over time, this creates a feedback loop where the official story becomes increasingly removed from the actual physical evidence, but appears more credible because contradictory findings have been systematically excluded from public discourse. Consider what happens when you start mapping these anomalous discoveries across time and geography. Advanced astronomical instruments appearing in monastery workshops, sophisticated chemical apparatus found in medieval laboratories, engineering tools that demonstrate knowledge of principles supposedly not rediscovered until the Renaissance. The pattern that emerges suggests not isolated instances of exceptional genius, but evidence of continuous technological development that was deliberately obscured from the historical record. But here's where the story takes an even stranger turn. Many of these advanced medieval artifacts share design characteristics with devices described in ancient texts that were supposedly lost during the Dark Ages. It's as if the knowledge preserved in those restricted archives wasn't just theoretical. It was being actively applied and developed throughout the medieval period, but only within carefully controlled circles that had access to the hidden libraries. This brings us to one of the most unsettling aspects of medieval knowledge management: the existence of parallel intellectual traditions. While the general population was being taught that learning was dangerous and curiosity was sinful, elite networks were maintaining sophisticated scholarly communities that continued advancing human understanding in secret. These weren't just isolated monasteries preserving ancient texts. They were active research communities developing new techniques, conducting experiments, and pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. Evidence for these parallel traditions can be found in the sudden appearance of advanced techniques during specific historical moments. When the Crusades required sophisticated military engineering, European armies somehow possessed knowledge of siege warfare that supposedly hadn't existed for centuries. When Gothic cathedrals needed mathematical precision, builders demonstrated understanding of structural principles that officially wouldn't be rediscovered until much later. When navigation demanded accurate astronomical calculations, medieval scholars produced star charts of remarkable accuracy. Where did this knowledge come from if the Dark Ages had truly been dark? The official explanation involves vague references to Byzantine preservation of classical learning, but this doesn't account for the obvious signs of continuous development and innovation. The techniques being applied weren't just preserved ancient methods. They showed clear evidence of centuries of refinement and improvement. The more logical explanation is that advanced learning never actually disappeared from Europe. Instead, it was driven underground, maintained within exclusive networks that had both the resources and the motivation to preserve dangerous knowledge. These communities would have operated much like secret societies, with initiation rituals, sworn oaths of secrecy, and carefully structured hierarchies designed to prevent unauthorized disclosure of protected information. This interpretation gains support from examining the symbol systems that appear throughout medieval art and architecture. Hidden within the decorative elements of churches, castles, and manuscripts, researchers have identified consistent patterns of mathematical relationships, astronomical alignments, and geometric principles that suggest sophisticated theoretical understanding. These weren't random decorative choices. They were encoded messages, ways of preserving and transmitting complex knowledge through visual symbols that could survive even if written records were destroyed. The builders of Gothic cathedrals, for example, embedded advanced mathematical concepts into their structures in ways that wouldn't be obvious to casual observers, but would be immediately recognizable to anyone with the proper training. The proportional relationships, the geometric patterns, the astronomical alignments, all of these served as three-dimensional textbooks, preserving knowledge in stone form that could survive political upheavals and religious persecutions. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of this knowledge preservation system involved the careful management of revelation timing. Information wasn't just hidden. It was strategically released when political conditions made such revelations advantageous. This explains why the Renaissance appeared to happen so suddenly and comprehensively. It wasn't a spontaneous rediscovery of lost learning. It was the coordinated unveiling of knowledge that had been preserved and developed throughout the supposedly dark centuries. The timing wasn't coincidental. Political fragmentation was weakening centralized church authority. New trade routes were creating demand for navigation and engineering knowledge, and emerging nation-states needed technological advantages over their rivals. Under these conditions, the gradual release of advanced knowledge served the interests of the institutions that had preserved it, allowing them to maintain influence and relevance in a changing world. This controlled revelation process explains many of the puzzling aspects of Renaissance innovation. Why did supposedly independent discoveries happen simultaneously across different regions? Because they weren't independent. They were coordinated releases from the same underlying knowledge base. Why did Renaissance masters seem to have access to unusually sophisticated source materials? Because they were connected to the networks that had preserved and developed those materials throughout the medieval period. The implications extend far beyond medieval history. If advanced knowledge was being systematically hidden and selectively revealed during the Dark Ages, what makes us think similar processes aren't operating today? The same institutional structures that managed medieval information control continued to evolve and adapt their techniques across subsequent centuries. The methods have become more subtle, but the fundamental principles remain the same. Control access to information, establish authorized interpretations, and marginalize dissenting voices. Modern academic institutions, for example, operate according to principles that would be familiar to medieval monastery schools. Knowledge is compartmentalized into specialized disciplines that discourage interdisciplinary synthesis. Research funding flows preferentially to projects that support established frameworks. Publication opportunities depend on peer review systems that prioritize conformity over innovation. Scholars learn to frame their investigations within acceptable parameters, avoiding lines of inquiry that might threaten established positions. This doesn't require conscious conspiracy. It simply reflects the natural tendency of institutional systems to perpetuate themselves. People who challenge fundamental assumptions find their career prospects diminished. Researchers who pursue inconvenient lines of investigation struggle to secure funding or publication opportunities. Over time, the scholarly community self-selects for individuals who are either unaware of the most challenging questions or unwilling to pursue them publicly. The result is a knowledge management system that appears open and democratic, but actually operates according to subtle but powerful mechanisms of control. Information that supports established narratives receives extensive development and dissemination. Information that challenges those narratives gets marginalized, reinterpreted, or ignored. The process is so gradual and seemingly natural that most participants don't even recognize it as censorship. This continuity between medieval and modern information control suggests that the Dark Ages mystery isn't just ancient history, It's a case study in techniques that continue to shape contemporary understanding. The institutions that managed knowledge during the medieval period didn't disappear when the Renaissance began. They evolved, adapted their methods to changing conditions, and continued to influence how societies understand their past and present. Understanding these historical patterns becomes crucial for anyone who wants to navigate contemporary information systems effectively. The same techniques that allowed medieval authorities to control historical narrative for centuries, restricting access to primary sources, establishing authorized interpretations, marginalizing dissenting voices, remain powerful tools for shaping public understanding today. The digital revolution has supposedly democratized access to information, but it has also created new opportunities for subtle manipulation. Algorithms can be designed to prioritize certain sources over others. Social media platforms can amplify approved narratives while suppressing alternative viewpoints. Academic databases can be structured to make certain types of research more difficult to conduct. The tools have evolved, but the fundamental principles of information control remain remarkably consistent with those developed during the medieval period. This doesn't mean that all contemporary knowledge is compromised or that all institutions are engaged in deliberate deception, but it does suggest that we need to approach received wisdom with the same skepticism that medieval scholars should have applied to church-controlled historical narratives. The techniques that created the Dark Ages myth continue to operate in evolved forms, and understanding how they work is essential for anyone who wants to distinguish between authentic knowledge and institutional storytelling. As you drift towards sleep, consider this unsettling possibility. The same forces that could hide a millennium of human achievement behind manufactured darkness might still be operating today, using more sophisticated tools but pursuing fundamentally similar objectives. The real question isn't whether institutional knowledge control exists. It's whether we've developed the intellectual tools necessary to recognize it when we encounter it. The shadows cast by medieval information management stretch far into our present, influencing not just what we know about the past, but how we think about knowledge itself. Every time we accept an expert opinion without examining the underlying evidence, every time we dismiss alternative interpretations without serious consideration, every time we allow institutional authority to substitute for independent investigation, we participate in the same system that created the Dark Ages myth. The night grows deeper, but the questions grow more urgent, because if they could successfully rebrand a millennium of human achievement as an age of ignorance and superstition, what other historical narratives might be equally artificial? What other truths might be hidden behind veils of institutional respectability? What other aspects of our understanding might be products of careful management rather than objective investigation? The game of historical hide-and-seek continues, but now we're beginning to understand not just what was hidden, but how the hiding was accomplished. And that knowledge changes everything, because once you recognize the techniques being used to control information, you start seeing those same techniques everywhere, in textbooks, in documentaries, in academic journals, in news reports, in all the sources we've been taught to trust without question. The Dark Ages weren't dark because knowledge disappeared. They were dark because knowledge was weaponized, turned into a tool for controlling how people understood their world and their place within it. And if that could happen once, in an age we consider primitive and superstitious, what makes us think it couldn't happen again in an age we consider enlightened and scientific? The patterns are there, waiting to be recognized. The techniques are still being used, evolved but not abandoned. The same institutional structures that created the Dark Ages myth continue to shape contemporary understanding, using methods that are more subtle but no less effective than their medieval predecessors. Sleep well, but sleep with questions. Because the deepest mysteries aren't hidden in the past. They're woven into the very fabric of how we think about knowledge, truth, and the reliability of the institutions we've been taught to trust. The story continues, and the shadows grow longer with each revelation. The web of deception runs even deeper than manipulated timelines and hidden archives. As we descend further into this rabbit hole of historical manipulation, we encounter something that should shake you to your very core. The same institutions that controlled medieval knowledge didn't just hide information. They systematically destroyed entire categories of human understanding, then rewrote the rules about what constituted legitimate knowledge in the first place. Consider this chilling reality. During the height of institutional control over European learning, thousands of texts were not merely hidden away in secret archives. They were deliberately destroyed in what can only be described as the greatest intellectual genocide in human history. Ancient works on natural philosophy, experimental methods, astronomical observations, mathematical principles, engineering techniques, medical practices, entire libraries of human achievement vanished not through accident or neglect, but through systematic elimination. The official story tells us these texts were destroyed by barbarian invasions or lost through the chaos of political collapse. But the timeline doesn't support this narrative. Many of these works survived well into the medieval period, documented in monastery catalogs and scholarly correspondence. They disappeared specifically during periods when institutional control over knowledge was being consolidated, when the Church was establishing its monopoly over what could be taught, studied, or even remembered. What's particularly disturbing is the selectivity of this destruction. Works that could be reinterpreted to support religious doctrine were preserved, often in heavily edited forms. Texts that presented alternative cosmologies, different approaches to understanding natural phenomena, or methods of investigation that bypassed religious authority were systematically eliminated. This wasn't random destruction. It was intellectual engineering on a massive scale. The process worked through multiple mechanisms. Direct destruction was reserved for the most dangerous texts, works that explicitly contradicted religious doctrine or provided alternative frameworks for understanding reality. More subtle manipulation involved what we might call textual poisoning, copying ancient works but introducing subtle changes that altered their meaning or effectiveness. Mathematical treatises would have crucial calculations modified. Medical texts would have dangerous or challenging treatments removed. Philosophical works would be edited to align with approved theological positions. Over time, these modified versions became the only available copies. Scholars working from corrupted texts would find their experiments failing, their calculations producing incorrect results, their philosophical investigations leading to dead ends. The failure of these approaches would then be cited as evidence that non-religious methods of understanding the world were fundamentally flawed. It was a perfect closed loop. Sabotage the tools, then point to their failure as proof that only approved methods could produce reliable knowledge. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of this knowledge destruction involved the elimination of entire conceptual frameworks. Ancient and early medieval scholars had developed sophisticated ways of thinking about natural phenomena that didn't require supernatural intervention. They had methods for investigating cause and effect, techniques for testing hypotheses, and frameworks for understanding the natural world as a coherent system operating according to discoverable principles. These conceptual tools were systematically eliminated from the intellectual toolkit available to medieval scholars. Instead, Students were taught to approach all phenomena through theological interpretation. Natural events were explained as divine interventions. Human achievements were attributed to miraculous assistance. The very idea that natural phenomena might operate according to consistent, discoverable principles was branded as dangerous pride that challenged divine authority. The result was the creation of what we might call cognitive darkness, not the absence of information, but the absence of effective tools for processing information. Medieval scholars weren't stupid or ignorant. They were working with deliberately crippled intellectual equipment, like astronomers forced to use telescopes with clouded lenses or mathematicians denied access to essential calculating techniques. This cognitive sabotage explains one of the most puzzling aspects of medieval intellectual life. We know that medieval scholars had access to many classical texts, yet they seemed incapable of building upon them in the ways we might expect. They could copy ancient works, translate them, even comment upon them, but they couldn't use them as foundations for continued investigation and development. This wasn't due to inherent limitations. It was the result of systematic removal of the conceptual tools necessary for effective intellectual progress. The evidence for this deliberate crippling of human intellectual capacity can be found in the sudden reappearance of effective investigative methods during the Renaissance. Supposedly lost techniques for experimental investigation, mathematical analysis, and systematic observation didn't just randomly resurface. They were reintroduced in coordinated fashion, often by scholars who had gained access to restricted archives or private collections that had preserved the complete, unedited versions of ancient texts. Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks provide a perfect example of this pattern. His approaches to engineering problems, his methods of anatomical investigation, his techniques for systematic observation, none of these show the gradual development you'd expect from someone reconstructing lost knowledge through trial and error. Instead, they demonstrate sophisticated understanding of investigative methods that had clearly been preserved and developed throughout the supposedly dark centuries, but kept hidden from general scholarly discourse. The same pattern appears across multiple fields during the Renaissance period. Advanced mathematical techniques suddenly reappear in forms that suggest continuous development rather than rediscovery. Experimental methods emerge fully formed rather than evolving gradually. Systematic approaches to natural investigation appear simultaneously in multiple locations, as if they were being revealed from common sources rather than independently invented. This coordinated reappearance of effective intellectual tools suggests that the Renaissance wasn't a spontaneous revival of human curiosity. It was a managed restoration of deliberately suppressed capabilities. The institutions that had spent centuries eliminating dangerous ways of thinking were now selectively reintroducing them under conditions that ensured continued institutional control. But why would the same institutions that had worked so hard to eliminate independent intellectual capabilities suddenly decide to restore them? The answer lies in changing political and economic conditions that made intellectual innovation necessary for institutional survival. The rise of competing power centers, the development of international trade networks, the emergence of technological challenges that required sophisticated solutions, all of these created pressures that forced established institutions to release previously restricted knowledge. However, this restoration came with built-in safeguards designed to prevent intellectual independence from threatening institutional authority. The new learning was channeled through university systems controlled by religious institutions. Experimental methods were taught within theological frameworks that maintained divine authority over ultimate questions. Mathematical techniques were presented as tools for practical application rather than methods for investigating fundamental principles of reality. Most importantly, the historical narrative was carefully constructed to present this managed restoration as a spontaneous human awakening after centuries of darkness. By maintaining the myth of the Dark Ages, institutional authorities could claim credit for bringing light back to the world, while obscuring their role in creating the darkness in the first place. This pattern of deliberate intellectual sabotage followed by managed restoration reveals something profoundly disturbing about how institutional power operates. It's not enough for such institutions to control current information flows. They must also control how people think about the nature of knowledge itself. By demonstrating that independent investigation leads to failure, while approved methods produce success, they create populations that voluntarily surrender their intellectual autonomy. The techniques developed during the medieval period for managing human intellectual capacity didn't disappear when the Renaissance began. They evolved, adapted to changing conditions, and continue to operate in sophisticated forms today. Modern educational systems, for example, employ many of the same principles that medieval monastery schools used to channel curiosity into approved directions while discouraging investigation of fundamental questions. Students learn to work within established disciplinary boundaries that prevent them from developing comprehensive understanding of complex phenomena. They're taught to rely on expert authority rather than developing independent analytical capabilities. They're encouraged to master approved techniques while avoiding questions about the assumptions underlying those techniques. Most importantly, they're trained to see intellectual achievement as dependent on institutional validation rather than objective investigation of reality. The result is the production of highly educated populations that are nonetheless intellectually dependent on institutional guidance. Like medieval scholars working with corrupted texts, modern experts often find themselves applying sophisticated techniques to solve problems within frameworks that prevent them from questioning whether they're asking the right questions in the first place. This doesn't require conscious conspiracy among contemporary educators or researchers. The system operates through structural incentives that reward conformity to established patterns while punishing intellectual independence. Researchers who challenge fundamental assumptions find their work difficult to publish, their funding applications rejected, their career prospects diminished. Over time, the academic community self-selects for individuals who either don't recognize the most challenging questions or choose not to pursue them publicly. The continuity between medieval and modern intellectual control suggests that the Dark Ages weren't an aberration. They were a prototype. The techniques developed for managing human intellectual capacity during that period established patterns that continue to shape how societies approach knowledge, education, and the relationship between individual understanding and institutional authority. Understanding this historical continuity becomes crucial for anyone who wants to develop genuine intellectual independence. The same methods that created cognitive darkness during the medieval period continue to operate today, using more subtle techniques but pursuing fundamentally similar objectives. Recognizing these patterns is the first step toward developing the intellectual tools necessary to navigate contemporary information systems without falling into the same traps that limited medieval scholars. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider this unsettling possibility. The institutions we trust to educate us and expand human understanding may be using evolved versions of the same techniques that created the intellectual darkness of the medieval period. The tools have become more sophisticated, but the fundamental objective remains the same: producing populations that are knowledgeable enough to be useful, but not independent enough to be dangerous. The real Dark Ages weren't 1,000 years in the past. They were a method, a system, a way of managing human intellectual capacity that has been refined and adapted across centuries, but never truly abandoned. Every time we accept expert opinion without examining underlying assumptions, every time we limit our investigations to approved methods and acceptable questions, every time we allow institutional authority to substitute for independent analysis, we participate in the same system that created the medieval cognitive darkness. The patterns are there, woven into the fabric of how we approach learning, research, and the development of understanding. The techniques that eliminated effective intellectual tools during the medieval period continue to operate, preventing us from developing the analytical capabilities necessary to recognize their influence on contemporary thought. The night grows deeper, but the questions grow more urgent. Because if they could successfully eliminate humanity's most effective tools for understanding reality, then convince us that this intellectual crippling represented a natural state of ignorance, what other capabilities might we have lost without even realizing they once existed? The shadows cast by medieval intellectual control stretch far into our present, shaping not just what we know, but how we think about the nature of knowledge itself. And until we recognize these patterns, until we understand how intellectual darkness was created and maintained, we remain vulnerable to the same techniques that turn the light of human understanding into the manufactured darkness of the ages we've been taught to call dark. The game continues, the shadows deepen, and the most important questions remain hidden behind veils of institutional respectability and academic respectability that would be familiar to any medieval monastery school administrator. The methods have evolved, but the fundamental objective remains unchanged, keeping humanity intellectually dependent on institutional guidance while maintaining the illusion of intellectual freedom and progress. Sleep well, but sleep with the knowledge that the darkness was never natural, never inevitable, and never truly ended. It was manufactured, maintained, and continues to operate through techniques so subtle that most people never recognize their influence on contemporary thought and understanding. The deepest mystery isn't what knowledge was lost during the Dark Ages. It's what intellectual capabilities were still being prevented from developing, what questions were still being trained not to ask, and what understanding we're still being taught to approach only through approved institutional channels. The story continues, and the most important chapters are yet to be written by those who learn to recognize the patterns and develop the courage to investigate the questions that institutional authority prefers to keep hidden in the shadows of manufactured ignorance. The strangest part of this entire deception isn't what they hid, but what they replaced it with. Because when you systematically eliminate humanity's most effective tools for understanding reality, you don't leave a vacuum. You fill that empty space with something else, something that serves your purposes while keeping people convinced they're still thinking clearly. What filled the intellectual void created by medieval knowledge destruction was perhaps the most sophisticated system of thought control ever devised. It wasn't crude censorship or obvious propaganda. It was something far more elegant and insidious. The creation of entire fields of pseudo-knowledge that felt rigorous and scholarly, but were actually designed to prevent real understanding from developing. Medieval scholasticism represents the perfection of this technique. Students would spend years mastering complex logical systems, memorizing vast amounts of information, and engaging in sophisticated debates that appeared to demonstrate the highest forms of intellectual achievement. Yet all of this impressive mental activity was channeled within frameworks that prevented any challenge to fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. The scholastic method taught students to analyze texts with extraordinary precision, to construct elaborate logical arguments, and to engage with complex philosophical questions. But the texts being analyzed were carefully selected. The logical frameworks were designed to support predetermined conclusions, and the philosophical questions were formulated in ways that made certain answers impossible to reach. It was intellectual theater on a grand scale, all the appearance of rigorous thinking with none of the actual freedom necessary for genuine discovery. Students emerged from this system convinced they had received the finest education possible, never realizing they had been trained in sophisticated methods of not thinking about the most important questions. This pseudo-educational system served multiple purposes simultaneously. It absorbed the intellectual energy of potentially dangerous minds, channeling curiosity into safe directions. It created a class of scholars who were genuinely learned, but fundamentally dependent on institutional guidance. Most importantly, it established the principle that real knowledge required institutional validation, that individual investigation was inherently unreliable compared to approved scholarly methods. The techniques developed during this period for managing intellectual curiosity were so effective that they became templates for educational systems across subsequent centuries. The university structure, the disciplinary boundaries, the emphasis on mastering approved methods rather than questioning underlying assumptions. All of these trace their origins back to medieval innovations in thought control. But perhaps the most brilliant aspect of this system was how it created the illusion of intellectual progress while preventing any real advancement in understanding fundamental questions about reality. Scholars could spend lifetimes mastering increasingly complex elaborations of approved frameworks, publishing extensive commentaries on accepted authorities, and engaging in debates that demonstrated impressive erudition while never approaching any genuine challenge to institutional power. This pattern explains one of the most puzzling aspects of medieval intellectual history. We have extensive records of scholarly activity during this period. Thousands of manuscripts, detailed commentaries on classical texts, sophisticated theological treatises. Yet somehow all this impressive intellectual activity failed to produce the kind of cumulative advancement in understanding that we see in other periods and cultures. The reason becomes clear when you realize that all this scholarly energy was being deliberately channeled away from the most productive lines of investigation. Medieval scholars weren't less intelligent than their predecessors or successors. They were working within intellectual frameworks specifically designed to prevent effective investigation of natural phenomena and social structures. Consider how this system handled potentially dangerous questions about the natural world. Rather than forbidding such investigations entirely, which might have created obvious intellectual martyrs, the system encouraged elaborate theoretical speculation about natural phenomena, while discouraging empirical testing of theoretical claims. Students could spend years debating how many angels could dance on the head of a pin, but they were trained to consider direct observation of natural processes as somehow less reliable than logical deduction from approved authorities. This created a culture where intellectual sophistication was measured by the ability to construct complex arguments based on textual authority, rather than the capacity to investigate reality directly. The most respected scholars were those who could produce the most elaborate commentaries on ancient texts, not those who might discover new facts about how the world actually worked. The social consequences of this intellectual misdirection were profound. Potential innovators and investigators were absorbed into systems that rewarded conformity to established patterns while punishing genuine curiosity about fundamental questions. The intellectual energy that might have produced scientific revolutions or social innovations was channeled into increasingly complex elaborations of approved frameworks that prevented any real challenge to existing power structures. This wasn't an accident or an unintended consequence of religious devotion. The evidence suggests it was a carefully designed system for managing human intellectual capacity in ways that served institutional interests while maintaining the appearance of scholarly rigor and intellectual freedom. The proof of this intentional design can be found in how quickly and comprehensively the system changed when political conditions made intellectual innovation necessary for institutional survival. The same institutions that had spent centuries discouraging empirical investigation suddenly began promoting experimental methods when technological advancement became essential for maintaining competitive advantage. The Renaissance transformation wasn't a gradual evolution of medieval scholasticism. It was an abrupt replacement of one intellectual system with another. The speed and comprehensiveness of this change suggests that alternative methods had been preserved and developed throughout the medieval period, but kept restricted to elite circles that understood their potential danger to established authority. This pattern of intellectual control through misdirection, rather than suppression, became the template for managing human mental capacity in subsequent periods. Modern educational systems employ remarkably similar techniques, channeling curiosity into approved directions, rewarding mastery of complex but ultimately sterile methodologies, and creating the illusion of intellectual achievement while preventing investigation of fundamental questions about social and natural reality. The key insight is that effective thought control doesn't require preventing people from thinking. It requires teaching them to think in ways that feel rigorous and scholarly, but actually prevent them from reaching conclusions that might threaten institutional authority. The most sophisticated forms of intellectual control work by giving people the tools they need to feel smart, while denying them the tools they would need to be truly independent. Contemporary academic disciplines operate according to principles that would be familiar to any medieval scholastic master. Students learn to work within established paradigms that define what questions are worth asking and what methods are appropriate for investigating them. They master complex technical vocabularies that create the appearance of precision while actually obscuring rather than clarifying fundamental issues. They engage in debates that demonstrate impressive erudition while carefully avoiding any challenge to the assumptions underlying their entire field of study. The result is the production of highly educated populations that are nonetheless intellectually dependent on institutional guidance for understanding the most important questions about reality. Like medieval scholars debating angels on pinheads, modern experts often find themselves applying sophisticated analytical techniques to problems defined in ways that prevent them from recognizing the most fundamental issues at stake. This doesn't mean that all contemporary scholarship is worthless, or that modern institutions are consciously engaged in deliberate deception. But it does suggest that the techniques developed during the medieval period for channeling intellectual energy away from dangerous questions continue to operate in evolved forms that most participants don't even recognize. The continuity is particularly visible in how both medieval and modern educational systems handle potentially subversive ideas. Rather than forbidding such investigations entirely, which might create obvious martyrs or generate dangerous curiosity, the systems encourage theoretical speculation while discouraging practical application. Students can study radical critiques of existing systems, but they're trained to treat such studies as abstract intellectual exercises rather than blueprints for real change. This creates a safety valve that allows potentially dangerous ideas to be discussed in academic settings while preventing them from developing into effective challenges to institutional authority. The most subversive concepts become topics for scholarly dissertations that demonstrate the author's intellectual sophistication, while carefully avoiding any suggestion that such ideas might be practically implemented. The medieval period established the principle that intellectual respectability requires institutional validation, and this principle continues to shape how people approach knowledge in contemporary settings. Independent investigation is automatically suspect, while ideas that have received proper academic credentialing are presumed to be more reliable regardless of their actual merit or practical effectiveness. Understanding these historical patterns becomes crucial for anyone who wants to develop genuine intellectual independence rather than sophisticated forms of intellectual dependence. The techniques that created cognitive darkness during the medieval period continue to operate today, using more subtle methods, but pursuing fundamentally similar objectives. The real challenge isn't accessing information. In the digital age, vast amounts of data are readily available. The challenge is developing the analytical tools necessary to distinguish between genuine knowledge and sophisticated forms of intellectual misdirection. And those tools can only be developed by people who understand how thought control systems operate and have the courage to investigate questions that institutional authority prefers to keep hidden behind veils of academic respectability. As consciousness drifts toward sleep, consider this disturbing possibility. The same institutions that perfected techniques for intellectual control during the medieval period continue to shape how we think about knowledge, education, and the relationship between individual understanding and institutional authority. The methods have become more sophisticated, but the fundamental objectives remain unchanged. Every time we accept expert opinion without examining the assumptions underlying that expertise, every time we limit our investigations to academically approved methods and institutionally sanctioned questions, every time we mistake complex technical vocabulary for genuine precision of thought, we participate in systems that would be immediately recognizable to any medieval scholastic master. The patterns are there, woven into the fabric of contemporary intellectual life. The techniques that prevented medieval scholars from developing effective understanding of natural and social reality continue to operate, preventing modern populations from developing the analytical capabilities necessary to recognize institutional manipulation when they encounter it. The night grows deeper, and the questions become more urgent. Because if they could successfully channel human intellectual energy into elaborate forms of pseudo-thinking that felt rigorous but prevented real understanding, what makes us think similar techniques aren't being used today to manage contemporary populations in ways that serve institutional interests while maintaining the illusion of intellectual freedom? The shadows cast by medieval thought control stretch far into our present, shaping not just what we know, but how we approach the process of knowing itself. Until we recognize these patterns, until we understand how intellectual misdirection was perfected during the medieval period, we remain vulnerable to evolved versions of the same techniques that turned genuine scholarly inquiry into elaborate forms of institutional theater. The game continues, with rules established centuries ago but refined across generations of practice. The most dangerous questions aren't forbidden. They're channeled into safe forms of academic speculation that allow people to feel intellectually sophisticated while preventing them from developing the practical understanding necessary to challenge the systems that shaped their education. Sleep comes with the knowledge that the darkness was never just about hiding information. It was about replacing effective methods of understanding reality with sophisticated forms of intellectual entertainment that kept potentially dangerous minds busy while preventing them from discovering truths that might threaten institutional authority. The deepest mystery isn't what knowledge was suppressed during the Dark Ages. It's what forms of pseudo-knowledge were still being taught to mistake for genuine understanding, what elaborate intellectual systems were still being trained to work within instead of questioning, And what sophisticated methods of not thinking were still being taught to admire as examples of scholarly rigor? The story continues, written in invisible ink across the pages of educational curricula, academic journals, and institutional policies that shape how entire populations approach the most fundamental questions about reality. And the most important revelation is yet to come: the recognition that intellectual freedom isn't something that was lost and recovered during historical periods, but something that must be consciously developed by individuals who understand how systems of thought control operate and have the courage to think outside approved frameworks. The night deepens, but the patterns become clearer for those who learn to recognize them. The medieval period didn't end. It evolved, adapted its techniques to changing conditions, and continues to shape contemporary consciousness through methods so subtle that most people never realize their intellectual development has been carefully managed to serve interests other than their own. The most chilling revelation comes when you realize that the techniques perfected during the medieval period weren't abandoned when the Renaissance began. They were refined, adapted, and integrated into systems that continue to shape human consciousness today. The same institutions that spent centuries managing medieval knowledge didn't disappear or reform themselves. They evolved, developing increasingly sophisticated methods for controlling how people think about reality itself. Modern academic institutions operate according to principles that would be instantly recognizable to any medieval monastery administrator. Knowledge is compartmentalized into specialized disciplines that prevent students from developing comprehensive understanding of complex phenomena. Research funding flows preferentially to investigations that support established frameworks while avoiding questions that might threaten institutional authority. Publication opportunities depend on peer review systems that reward conformity to approved methodologies while marginalizing genuinely innovative approaches. The result is an educational system that produces highly trained specialists who are nonetheless intellectually dependent on institutional guidance for understanding the broader implications of their work. Like medieval scholars working within carefully constructed theological frameworks, modern experts often find themselves applying sophisticated techniques to problems defined in ways that prevent them from recognizing the most fundamental issues at stake. Consider how this system handles potentially dangerous ideas in contemporary settings. Rather than forbidding subversive investigations entirely, which might create obvious intellectual martyrs, the system encourages theoretical speculation while discouraging practical application. Students can study radical critiques of existing power structures, but they're trained to treat such studies as abstract intellectual exercises rather than blueprints for understanding how those systems actually operate. This creates a perfect safety valve that allows potentially dangerous ideas to be discussed in academic settings, while preventing them from developing into effective challenges to institutional authority. The most subversive concepts become topics for scholarly dissertations that demonstrate intellectual sophistication while carefully avoiding any suggestion that such ideas might be practically relevant to contemporary conditions. The continuity between medieval and modern thought control becomes particularly visible when you examine how both systems handle the relationship between individual investigation and institutional authority. Medieval scholars were taught that personal observation was inherently unreliable compared to approved textual authorities. Modern students learn that individual analysis is automatically suspect unless it receives proper academic credentialing and institutional validation. This principle has become so deeply embedded in contemporary culture that most people automatically dismiss ideas that haven't received official scholarly approval, regardless of their actual merit or practical effectiveness. Independent investigation is presumed to be less reliable than institutionally validated research, even when that research is conducted within frameworks designed to prevent genuine discovery of inconvenient truths. The digital age has supposedly democratized access to information, but it has also created new opportunities for applying medieval techniques of knowledge management to contemporary populations. Search algorithms can be designed to prioritize certain sources while marginalizing others. Social media platforms can amplify approved narratives while suppressing alternative viewpoints. Online educational resources can be structured to channel curiosity into safe directions while discouraging investigation of fundamental questions. Most importantly, the sheer volume of available information creates the perfect environment for sophisticated forms of intellectual misdirection. When people are overwhelmed by data, they become more dependent on institutional authorities to help them distinguish between reliable and unreliable sources. This dependency relationship recreates the same power dynamic that existed between medieval scholars and church authorities, but in forms so subtle that most participants don't recognize the parallels. The techniques that created cognitive darkness during the medieval period continue to operate today because they address a fundamental challenge that all institutional power structures face: how to manage populations that are educated enough to be useful but not independent enough to be dangerous. The solution developed during the medieval period, providing sophisticated tools for thinking within approved frameworks while preventing the development of tools for questioning those frameworks themselves, remains as effective today as it was centuries ago. This doesn't require conscious conspiracy among contemporary educators, researchers, or institutional administrators. The system operates through structural incentives that reward conformity to established patterns while punishing intellectual independence. People who challenge fundamental assumptions find their work difficult to publish, their funding applications rejected, their career prospects diminished. Over time, the academic community self-selects for individuals who either don't recognize the most challenging questions or choose not to pursue them publicly. The most sophisticated aspect of this system is how it creates the illusion of intellectual progress while preventing any real advancement in understanding the most fundamental questions about social and natural reality. Scholars can spend lifetimes mastering increasingly complex elaborations of approved methodologies, publishing extensive research within established paradigms, and engaging in debates that demonstrate impressive erudition while never approaching any genuine challenge to the assumptions underlying their entire field of study. This pattern explains why so many contemporary intellectual disciplines seem to generate enormous amounts of activity without producing corresponding advances in practical understanding. Like medieval scholars debating increasingly elaborate theological questions, modern experts often find themselves applying sophisticated analytical techniques to problems defined in ways that prevent them from recognizing whether they're asking the right questions in the first place. As the night draws to a close and your mind drifts toward rest, carry with you this unsettling truth. The Dark Ages were never about darkness at all. They were about the careful management of light itself, the systematic control of human understanding by institutions that understood that true power lies not in ruling bodies, but in shaping minds. The evidence stretches across centuries: manipulated timelines, hidden archives, destroyed texts, and most insidiously, the replacement of genuine inquiry with elaborate systems of intellectual theater. What we call the Dark Ages may have been humanity's most sophisticated experiment in thought control, a prototype for techniques that continue to operate in evolved forms today. The shadows cast by medieval knowledge management reach far into our present, influencing not just what we know about the past, but how we approach the very process of understanding reality. The same institutions that perfected these techniques centuries ago didn't disappear when the Renaissance began. They adapted, refined their methods, and continue to shape how entire populations think about knowledge, authority, and truth itself. Perhaps the most important revelation isn't what was hidden during those supposedly dark centuries, but what we're still being prevented from seeing. The patterns are there, woven into the fabric of contemporary education, academic research, and information systems. The techniques that once turned the light of human understanding into manufactured darkness continue to operate, subtle but effective, keeping us intellectually dependent while maintaining the illusion of freedom. Because until we recognize how darkness was created and maintained, we remain vulnerable to those who understand that the most effective way to control the future is to carefully manage our understanding of the past. The game continues, the shadows deepen, and the most important truths may still be waiting in the archives of those who prefer to keep history's deepest mysteries hidden in plain sight. Remember, sometimes the greatest conspiracies are hidden not in what they tell you, but in what they train you never to ask. Sweet dreams, and keep questioning.